Hello, everyone. There's a few people trickling in. I'll just give it a few seconds. So there's a few people here now, so we'll get started. Good morning and welcome to our Simon Talks. My name is Anna Marie Burke. I'm a policy analyst with the Simon Communities of Ireland. Wayne Stanley is normally here presenting, but unfortunately he's not available today. But I am delighted to be taking over and to have the opportunity to host this morning. We have a good number signed up for our Simon Talk, which is great. Good to have such strong interest, and thanks for you all to being here. There's a few more people coming in, which is lovely. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with our Simon Talks, this is a monthly webinar series that the Simon Communities has run since the beginning of the pandemic, when the whole world went online. We find them extremely useful. It helps us keep up to date with developments, research and policy in the area of housing and homelessness. It lets us dive into a number of different areas, but it also gives a platform to people and really interesting discussions, which is great that we're able to facilitate that. We will be joined today by Professor Conor O'Toole to discuss rental inflation and stabilisation policies. We have a growing number of people renting in Ireland, and so it's really important to examine our rental market regularly to see if the measures put in place are contributing to a stable and affordable rental market. Discussions today are drawn from a recent report from the ESRI that Conor was a co-author on, which examines the Irish rent pressure zones. The framework was introduced in Ireland in 2016, and so he was looking at how this worked in Ireland in the time leading up to the pandemic, with some comparisons on an international perspective as well. To introduce Conor more officially, Professor Conor O'Toole is an Associate Research Professor at the ESRI and an Adjunct Professor at Trinity College Dublin. His research covers the areas of macroeconomics, banking and the housing market. He is a co-editor of the ESRIs Quarterly Economic Commentary and has published in a number of leading academic journals, such as the Journal of Money, Credit and Banking, Review of Finance, and the Journal of Housing Economics. Prior to joining the ESRI, Conor has worked as a manager of the Macro-Financial Linkages Team in the Central Bank of Ireland. Our regular Simon Talks followers may recognise Conor. He joined us in January to look at the economic outlook for housing in 2022. That was a really good discussion, actually, and we upload all of our webinars to YouTube, so definitely go back and have a look if you have a chance. Please ask questions as we go through. We'll have 15 minutes or so at the end for questions, and they always generate a really interesting discussion, which is great. You can use the chat box or the Q&A function, whichever is easiest for you. Writing your questions as we go, and we'll get to them at the end. And if you're sharing on social media, and please do, use our hashtag Simon Talks, and we would love to see it. So without further ado, I will pass you on now to Conor.
Thanks, Anna-Marie. A real pleasure to be back here again at the Simon Talks, having done the one on the economic outlook in January. A very changed outlook now, given where we've come in the last 6 months or so, in particular since the Ukraine invasion. So maybe that's one we can re-explore again in the future.
Definitely.
So what I'm here to talk about this morning, and let me just share my slides. Okay, great. What I'm here to talk about is research that we've been doing in a report we released a couple of months ago, but also over a kind of series of research papers we've done for a number of years on the rent stabilisation measures in an Irish context. So that's the rent pressure zones, which I'll recap on a little bit. So what I'm going to try and do today is give you a flavour for some of the work that we've done, but also to contextualise what's happened in Ireland and the type of measures we have in Ireland within a broader international context. You know, these type of rent regulations have a very long history, and economists in particular don't always agree on how good or bad that history has been. And there's a number of well-known challenges that come with regulations on market prices and rent controls in particular. So what I'm hoping to do for the next 40 minutes or so is to just take you through the research internationally, take you through some of the work that we've done on Ireland, talk through some of the findings from the analysis and the data, think about some of the calibration options around the regulations and the regulatory structures, and then happy to take any questions. Okay, so let's just quickly recap for any of you who aren't familiar or aren't completely familiar with the detail of the rent pressure zones. I'm sure that this audience is well aware of them. Basically, they were introduced, as Anna Marie has said, in late 2016 to place a cap on the growth rate of rents at the property level. And they were designed to be implemented in areas of high growth and high rent levels. So to qualify at that particular time, qualification could be done at two levels. One is the local electoral area and one is a local authority area. And there were differing conditions attached to your qualification. So, for example, the first condition was that your rent had to be growing very quickly, so had to grow by greater than 7% for 4 of the last 6 quarters. But also then there was a level condition, so your rents had to be in that particular quarter had to be greater than a specified reference rate. Now, it was the national standardized average at the start, but now there's currently 3 depending on the geographic area. So, why were these regulations brought in? What was the motivation for this particular type of framework? Because, Ireland was a country which really didn't have a huge number of regulations on the price levels in the rental sector for many, many years. You'd have to go back to the early 80s and before that to the period when there were particularly strong rent controls in terms of, I'm talking about price caps in particular, on the private rental sector in Ireland. So this really was a departure from the policy design that we had in the sector before. But I think the motivation for these regulations is very, very clear when you see a chart like this, which looks like at the inflation rate, or sorry, this looks at the index of new rents in the private rental sector from the index that's produced with the RTB. You can see the period following the financial crisis, there was a downturn in rents, very, very strong downturn in rents. But when the economy began to recover and that recovery kicked in from 2014 onwards, you can see there's only been one-way traffic in terms of the directionality of rents. They've been rising both nationally, in particular in the early phase in Dublin, and but also on a countrywide basis. So there's this very strong increase in the rent levels. And that kind of came with a general concern around the affordability of rent prices in the rental sector. And that basically was part of the motivation for the introduction of a framework which would target areas which had high rental inflation in the Irish context. So where did these regulations apply? Well, they started off, so I'm going to make 2 distinctions in this particular piece of research, and you'll see it dotted throughout the paper, but also the presentation. I'm going to talk about the classifications as RPZs in 2 particular waves. The first wave was the end 2016, 2017 wave of classifications, and that you can see here in the map is in red. So these are the local electoral areas in Ireland. And that basically picked up Dublin, a good chunk of the surrounding counties, and the cities of Cork and Galway. So they were the first areas to receive the designation status as rent pressure zones. So therefore, within those areas, rents had to grow at a maximum of a 4% inflation rate at the start when they were designated. Then there was kind of a period where there weren't any classifications. And then in 2019, which is what I've classed here as the second wave of classifications, there were a couple towards the end of the second quarter, the start of the second quarter of 2019. But then there was a change in the classification for the reference rate at the end of in the kind of summer 2019, and that led to a number of designations, particular again around the Mideast, the kind of counties and the local electoral areas surrounding the bloc that had been previously classified in the Mideast, but also some of the larger urban towns in the Midlands and Waterford and Limerick cities. So there was a kind of two-phased waiving of the designations, and this is kind of where and how they rolled out across the country in response to the rental inflationary pressures that we were seeing over the period from 2016 onwards. Just to note that this map was what was used for the research. It's not to be confused with the current position. It stops just before the pandemic in 2020. Okay, so what am I going to do in terms of the analytical evidence I'm going to talk to you about today? So the first thing I'm going to do is give that international context, that international positioning. I think that's critically important for all of our understanding of how and where and why rent controls work. And then I'm going to talk to you about the empirical analysis that we did, which kind of updates a previous report we'd done, which didn't have the second wave of classifications in it, and then looks at some scenarios and around the macroeconomic projections and some of the calibration options. So that's kind of the roadmap for today's discussion. Okay, so let me talk about the academic research, and anyone who maybe has looked into this in a little bit of detail will know that there's hundreds and hundreds of academic papers out there looking at various aspects of the rent control. It's kind of a favorite go-to topic for many economists to think about how price caps work and the effects of price caps on markets. So it really is a very deep and very broad literature on rent controls. The general literature, in particular, a couple of the kind of classification articles in the literature, use this kind of designation as first, second, or third generation controls. So the way they kind of differentiate between these is that the first generation controls, these had put strict price ceilings in nominal terms, which basically means a rent freeze, a nominal rent freeze. So in real terms, which means adjusting for inflation, rents will be falling. And that was kind of all of the measures that were brought in before or around the Second World War in the early 50s internationally were of this type of rent cap. This then moved, just kind of segued into a second generation cap. And this was a little bit different because obviously one of the things that was observed from the first generation rent controls was that they had huge side effects. So when they introduced in many jurisdictions these caps, these nominal rent freezes, often what happened was what we call the supply side externalities. So that means investment in the sector dropped markedly, and by investment I mean both the supply of new dwellings, both the maintenance and upkeep of the existing dwellings, but also the number of properties in the market. Landlords would sell out of the market, and this is what happened internationally with some of these regulations. In terms of the second generation rent controls, they tried to adjust a little bit for what was happening with those type of caps, and instead of having a nominal rent freeze, they allowed some inflation to happen, and then the differentiation there was whether the caps were brought in between tenancies. So for example, if the tenant changes, could you change the rent by more than the cap, or did it stay between tenancies? So for example, was it basically a cap at the property level like what we have in Ireland? This kind of was superseded by a further thinking around the designation, which basically only had controls within tenancies. So if you change the tenant, then the rent could reset to market rates, and that's kind of the third generation. And this was seen as quite market friendly because it would allow landlords at a tenancy change to reprice to market, and that would allow them to kind of keep those rents up with the environment. In general, what we've seen is that the movement from first to third generation does mitigate some of the challenges, but it does depend on the calibration and the design of these. And I guess underlying all of this, this discussion is the fact that the benefit of these rent controls always accrues to the incumbent tenants. So it's very clear that incumbent tenants experience lower inflation rates than they otherwise would have been, therefore a boost to affordability when these type of measures are brought in. Then I've kind of made a separate distinction, which I think is important, and that's between the rent stabilization measures. So these are kind of a hybrid of some of the measures that went before. And this is kind of where I classify Ireland. Others classify Ireland as the second generation, but I would kind of classify Ireland in this hybrid situation. And that's really because the targeting of where the rent controls go is very, very specific to particular areas of the country which experience affordability problems. And this is, for example, the high rent, high growth rate, high level areas, which we have used the conditionality around the designation criteria for the RPZs. These type of measures have been brought in not only in Ireland, but in other jurisdictions in Germany, some of the US states and France. Scotland tried to bring it in, but haven't actually. They have a framework, but they have no classifications. So in a sense, this is important for us to frame our discussion, because the evidence around the price moderation effects and also the supply effects can be different in these rent stabilization measures, in particular where you have exemptions for some of the side effects, for example, supply maintenance exemptions to the cap, and also the new supply exemptions to the caps. Just to kind of give a bit of a flavor of where the different markets in Europe look. This is from a research paper by Katunen and Ronavara. Basically show that a majority of markets in Europe are free market. Ireland, they classify as this kind of second generation rent cap because it stays at the property, doesn't change with the tenant, and there's fewer of those in the European context, with more where there are regulations in this kind of third generation space. Okay, so I guess the way to sum up from our side is that there's a very clear economic rationale for the use of rent controls internationally in settings where there are market failures or information asymmetries, or really extreme periods of excess demand coupled with the inelastic supply we've seen in housing markets. So certainly there can be an economic rationale and a case made for the introduction of these type of instruments, carefully calibrated, of course, in markets where you have these market failures and these kind of conditions which suggest a dysfunction in the way that the market is operating. And we're thinking purely about an economics case for a particular instrument. Numerous studies, a multitude of studies do demonstrate the benefit for existing tenants. They have lower rent levels, lower inflation rates over time, and that is clear. There are a number of other effects that can occur, such as lower labor market mobility, where tenants stay in their rent control property because they don't want to lose that designation status, and therefore they don't move around the labor market, they don't move around jurisdictions. But this is mainly more in larger countries like the US, where they have very mobile populations and a huge amount of internal migration. I think the one that we always need to be cognizant of, and certainly that we are from our point of view, is the evidence around the supply side effects. And this is the demonstration of the lower maintenance investment and the market exit of rental properties. That is clear in the literature. And I think that's an important point to always keep at the front of our minds when we're thinking about the type of structure we want in Ireland and the optimal regulatory design of that. And I think important to move on to that is, how do we mitigate some of these side effects? And I think what we've certainly seen in the Irish case in the design features of the regulations is to try and get the calibration decisions correct to offset some of those side effects. I guess one of the things is, subsequent to when we published our research, there was a huge body of evidence published by a team of researchers from University of Glasgow, led by Ken Gibb. And actually, one of the interesting things from our point of view was when we compared our own review of the international evidence to what they noted themselves, was a real concurrence and confluence of the type of effects that were found. You know, they were really noting the conventional case held up in many circumstances, you know, in terms of the reduction of supply, the misallocation of housing, the no investment, and all of these other labour market effects I've noted. But also some other issues around screening and mechanisms and discrimination, and the challenge that comes with trying to mitigate some of these effects in terms of the political commitment to the existing design. So, for example, if there aren't pre-commitment devices, then this can increase the uncertainty around future calibration decisions, and that can affect in itself the investment levels. So how and where you calibrate these things really matters. So that comes on to my kind of concluding remarks from the broad review from both our analysis, but also the Ken Gibb study, which I thought would be very useful to highlight, is that really when we think about how these type of regimes work internationally, it's all about calibration. So the devil really is in the detail about these regimes. What are the type of things that matters? Is the cap between or within tenancy in terms of the resets? Are the regulatory inflation rates allowed? Are they soft limits? So, for example, is it on the inflation rate? Is it a hard limit? Is it, for example, is it below the current broad inflation rate, or is it a level fix? How do you design and how do you develop your exemptions? Do they target maintenance? Do they allow for upgrades? Do they exempt new supply? Can we see a set of options within these frameworks which try as best they can to mitigate these side effects? Enforcement really is an important one. Do the rules get complied with? Do they work? How does enforcement work? And really then this comes back to context, which is something that was very prevalent in the Gibb report. The geographic scope, the location, the institutional setup, the other tenancy regulations that interact with the price caps. For example, security of tenure regulations. For example, some of the standards that go with these, the energy efficiency investments, etc. All of this context matters for how your calibration decisions work and how your rate controls apply. So really that kind of sums up the first element of the review that we did, but also the international literature on this. You know, what are the kind of key takeaways to take from this? You can clearly have an economic rationale for these type of measures. They can sit within a broader rental regulation framework quite consistently with an efficient economic setup, but the calibration has to be right. And because there are well-known and well-documented side effects that can happen, and we need to be cognizant of that over time. Okay, so let me move on then to try and talk a little bit about the Irish experience and what we have found for our exploration of the Irish data. So within this context, the aim of this part of our research was to explore how the rental inflation trends in Ireland in the classified areas had changed concurrent with the regulations. So we really wanted to know what had happened to rental prices in Ireland when these regulations were brought in. So we kind of walked through 4 different steps of a methodology to try and get at that. The first thing we did was we just explored some of the trends in the data, and I'll talk you through some of those in a moment. Second thing we did was an event study. So this is a kind of technique I'll talk through, which basically says, well, look, let's see what happened after these were introduced, treating all of the areas as having this classification at the same time, and look at a window before and after and explore what happened. We then moved on to do something a little bit more formal, more econometric, which tries to test statistically whether there are differences in the inflation rates between local electoral areas that were classified and unclassified. And then some of the most interesting research, I think, from my point of view, was we were able to get access to the property specific data from a matched sample from the Residential Tenancies Board data, which allowed us to follow the same property which registered numerous times in the database over time to see if we can explore what the observed inflation rate was at the property level and whether it was at or below 4%. So I think that was a really insightful and important piece of the research. And that, in a sense, is the update on the 2019 piece. I think I just want to be clear. Again, I mentioned it earlier, but just to formally note it, that throughout the rest of this analytical element, I'm going to be talking about two specific and distinct phases or waves of classifications. The first being the 2016-17 qualification. So, as I mentioned there, this is Dublin, Cork, Galway, the Kildare, Meath, Wicklow, and Elias and Drogheda, which were classified earlier in the RPZ's lifetime, and then the phase 2 qualifications, which came in 2019. So that was the Limerick City East, Navan, and then the post rules change group, which all came in towards between the middle of 2019 onwards, towards the end of that year. Okay, so let me present a couple of trends. We saw the very long-term trend in the index earlier had just gone in one direction since 2014, but I'm not sure if any of the Hawkeyes tuning into this would have seen that the end of that series had looked like there was a degree of moderation, and part of what we're interested in here was to explore, well, whether some of that moderation could be attributed to the framework, or was that just explained by general economic conditions and broader developments in the Irish economy. So that's kind of what we're trying to delve into in some depth here. Okay, so the chart on the left-hand side here shows the average growth rate over time from 2014 to 2020, with the blue dashed line being the period in which the classification began. And the red line is for all classified RPZs, so it mixes them together depending on when they came into the sample. And we can see clearly there appears to be a downward trend which occurs in and around the time of the introduction. It's not necessarily conclusive, and I wouldn't like to say this is a causal effect here, but there appears to be some sort of change in the trend concurrent to the timing of the introduction of the regulations. The right-hand chart, to try to disaggregate it a little bit, it breaks up the RPZs into three particular groups, one being the 2017 wave in blue, the 2019 wave in green, and then RPZ, and then local electoral areas that were never RPZs in red. And then the blue dashed line again is the first classification, the green dashed line being at the start of the 2019 classification group. And there again, we can see some evidence for the blue and for the green of a decline in the trend following the introduction of the regulations. That notwithstanding, you can also see that for the red group, there was also a decline in the trend that came in and around the same time as the regulations. So it isn't the case that all of that moderation is necessarily going to be due to the regulations, but there does appear to be downward effects. So we really want to tease this out to see whether or not some more of this can be distinguished to the group, to the introduction of the regulations. Okay, so I mentioned this event study analysis. What we do there is we set qualification. So whenever you qualify, that's set as time 0. And then we look at an interval around that, using a weighted average based on the number of observations, so the number of of registered tenancies within each LEA. So we allow the LEAs which have more tenancies to have more weight, more importance in the overall calculation. And this allows a comparable time frame across all groups. So what do we have here? On the left-hand side here, we have the group 1 RPZs, and this is you see the orange dashed line down the middle. That is the time 0, and then T-1 to T-12 are quarters before each area was classified, and then T+1 to T+11 are quarters after the qualification happened. And then the red bar is the average for the pre-period. The second is the green bar is the average for the post-period. And then the table gives those figures. So what we can see is that there, on average, was a decline of about 1.8 percentage points in the difference between the average before and the average after. And so there does appear to be some evidence of a change in an event window context. The second group here on the right-hand side, the second chart here, takes the group 2 RPZs. Now it only has 3 quarters included in it. Why is that? Because the second quarter of 2020, which would have been Q4, was when the pandemic hit, and there was such a structural economic change. Then we stopped our analysis at that period, and there were other legislative measures brought in, such as the national rent freeze. So it really would have confounded the effects of trying to look at the RPZ specifically. So we stopped our analysis at that particular period. And for that group, you can also see quite a clear moderation in the inflation rate post qualification. Okay, so we want to test a little bit more formally whether this would hold if we include it in a statistical analysis. So we do this thing called a difference in difference approach. So basically what we do is we try and explore whether the change in the growth rate is statistically significant for the group of RPZs, so for the group of LEAs that become RPZs after they are given their designation status relative to before. Okay, so we say, have you changed when you became an RPZ? Let's compare you to all of the non-RPZ areas and see if the difference between those two groups changed dramatically after they were classified. In a sense, what we have to do is, because the two groups, RPZs, non-RPZs, could have structural differences beforehand. For example, many of them are the urban areas, which are structurally different from some of the more rural areas. So we need to take that into consideration, which means we need to look at the difference between the two groups before and after the classification. So in a sense, what we're trying to get at here is there a change in the trend after these became RPZs? And again, we do find this. So the table here, what it does is the key figure to focus in on here is the RPZ coefficient. And so what this basically represents is the percentage point difference in the inflation rate after classification between the two groups. So if we look at the all RPZs figure here, what that says is that after the LEAs received classification, the inflation rate was 4 percentage points lower, this is a minus, than the non-RPZs. Okay, a little bit less for the 2017 phase is 2 percentage points, and a little bit more for the 2019 phase. I think the time frame matters here as well as the classification group. Okay, so let's move on to the final component of this particular analytical phase, and that looks at the distributional effects. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, what we're doing here is we're taking every single property and we're trying to match it to the same property in another time period. And what we find is we then calculate the growth rate for that property over time, so we can know how much did the rent change for a specific individual property. And then we look at those changes across all the properties in our sample that we can get at before and after they're classified. And we can create these graphs which show how much the inflation rates were across different groups of firms. So what do we have here for the charts? So if we look at the left-hand chart, this is the growth distribution for the first group of RPZs before and after they were given their assignment. So basically what we see here is a big spike at 0, okay? And then this long bunching that moves out to the right-hand side. And then each of these little bars here contains a percentage of data, okay? So if you look at the spike at 0, that means up to, you know, in the left-hand chart, nearly 20% of the property growth rates never changed. Okay, so there was 0 growth rate. So that's what that means, because growth rate is along the bottom axis. What we can clearly see here is because the orange is after the introduction of the regulations and the white is before the regulations. So if we see orange above white, there's more of the growth happening after the regulations. If the white is above the orange, you see more of it before. So what's very, very evident and very clear here is that this 4% peak, which is the orange peak you can see at the red dashed line, is the regulations, the 4% cap, which was the cap at the time we did this research. So you can very clearly see the impact of the regulations on the distribution. So a lot of the growth began to happen at the regulatory cap. Now, what is also clear, and this was evidenced from some previous research that we published as well, is that this more growth at or just below the cap was happening from both sides of the distribution. So you can see on the right-hand side of that chart, the white is above the orange, which means there's some fall in the growth rates happening at the top end of the distribution, but also there's white above orange at the lower points. So there's some growth coming up from low growth rates up to the 4%. So it's kind of the centralization of the cap, which is a feature that we can see in terms of regulations. Caps can sometimes act as an anchor point, and that's one of the limitations of these type of frameworks. But again, I think very clear the introduction of the caps is clear. On the right-hand chart here, that just takes it a little bit different, similar setup, but compares RPZs to non-RPZs after 2017. Okay, so you can see the RPZs are in the orange, so they have the spike at 4%. That is clear to see, and the non-RPZs don't have that spike. They are much more distributed. They have more 0 growth rates in this particular context, but there's a kind of a smoother series. It doesn't have that cap, so it's very clear to see the impact there. Okay, so let me kind of recap on those findings before I kind of move on to the calibration designs. So obviously a clear downward trend in the rents. We do find an effect of the regulations. I wouldn't like to attribute it fully causally, but it is there. The one thing I would like to note is that there are a lot of growth rates happening still above the 4% in this cap. So that's something that certainly needs consideration. But the caps have had an impact on the price distribution. Okay, the second bit, which I'm going to kind of go through quite quickly, because when this particular piece of analysis was completed, the macroeconomic context was very, very different to what we find it today, given that the war in Ukraine and the high inflationary environment. So one of the elements that we were trying to do was to try and to make sure that some of our previous findings, that difference between RPZs and non-RPZs, wasn't just explained by some economic differences between the two groups. So we estimated a series of models which tried to account for that and to try and explain whether that was actually a regulatory effect or was it something to do with the broader economy, and then to use this model that we designed to do that to have some scenario analysis. So just to present here some analysis for Cork, Dublin and Galway. And actually what this clearly shows is the model that we ran, which is the in-sample forecast, would have predicted higher inflation rates than actually had happened in the data. So therefore suggesting that if the regulations hadn't been in place, the rents would have been higher in these areas. As I noted, we also tried to do some forecasts, some outlook pieces for what would happen if these rent controls had been withdrawn from the Irish market. So basically, we took that macroeconomic model, rolled through some scenarios from for which had come about from colleagues of ours on the macroeconomic recovery from the pandemic, and to test what the rent outlook would have been. But as I said, it just wanted a bit more, and that was fine when we did the piece of work, but the macroeconomic context has changed very substantially since February of this year with the war in Ukraine. So some of this would need updating. Again, the key element here, which is a takeaway from this piece of work, is really that if the regulations were to be removed, we would expect much more rapid growth rates than would have been the case without the regulations. Okay, so let me move on to the final piece that I'm going to talk about today before I leave the floor open for questions and thoughts. This is around the calibration options. So obviously the international evidence is very clear on this. Calibration matters. The type of structure that you put together really matters for the impact of these regulations, both on incumbent tenants, but also on the supply side effects, which are the ones that really matter. And this is really to me where, if this type of framework, these type of rent controls are going to continue in the Irish market, and there's a good case for having a rent control framework defined, this is going to be an important element of it. How do we calibrate and set up the measures? So there's a couple of things that we highlight in the report that I just want to mention on these design elements, which I think are critical. So in terms of the two key ones, so obviously in the international literature, the two things that really stand out is one, you don't want to stop new supply, because if you have too strict a rent control, or if you've set rent level limits, then you can have a detrimental effect on new supply. And I think we're all in agreement that new supply is exactly what we need in the housing market in Ireland at present to try and address some of those bottlenecks. So therefore, the calibration of the Irish regulations to exempt the new supply can completely make sense in that context. The exemptions, which are attempting to target the maintenance and these other kind of energy efficiency investments, this is something I think we may want to consider going forward, about whether the specific setup of the type of exemptions that's allowable, and there's a multitude, whether that needs as a review to ensure we know whether the maintenance and investment in the particular dwellings is appropriate. This is particularly important in the context of the broader debates we're having around energy efficiency and the requirement to upgrade the rental stock for the transition to a low carbon economy. I think it's an important feature. One of the things we had talked about in the report was the indexation. The indexation makes sense when we think about having a link to broader price pressures, and I'll talk about that in a second. A lot of the international cases don't have a cap like we had, 4%. They have a CPI plus something. So they allow inflation rate and have a margin over and above that. And I think that kind of makes sense. One of the entry conditions for Ireland, we would argue have picked up those areas which have high rents and high inflation rates historically over the period of the operation of the conditions. This is something that needs to be considered again going forward if we're thinking about having a more permanent mechanism in place. In particular, where we have very few rental tenancies being agreed in particularly small areas around Ireland, potentially moving the criteria to take into account not just the new market rents, which is what the rent index does at the present, but to have all tenancies when the new registration stage come in place, maybe an important element to that. And within that, we'd also mention a point around having a smoothing component on the level criteria. So the growth rate condition says for the last 6 quarters, whereas the level condition is on 1 quarter. So if you have a lot of volatility in some of these small areas coming in and out, kind of a particular property that's very expensive comes into an area, pulls the rent up in that particular time point, that comes back down the next time point. Having a criteria which smooths out some of that would be advisable in our context. So I mentioned this. This is the indexation. From our point of view, when we were looking at this in detail, we're trying to think about what makes sense. Does it make sense to have indexation? Does it, and how do you set that up? A lot of the other jurisdictions have that we looked at here, this group, have a CPI plus. So they add a margin onto the CPI. Some of them are really high, because look at this, US states like California and Oregon, that their regulations are more aimed at really stopping very high inflation rates, whereas some of the others, like San Francisco, have lower, they let it set it below CPI. But in general, there are pros and cons to this indexation. We feel it makes sense. It's a good idea to have this, because it certainly allows the cap to grow in a broad. For example, if you have a move from a low inflation environment to a high inflation environment, if you have an indexed link, then that makes sure that the cost side can be passed through to the rental side, and that can try and offset some of the negative side effects. But that does have the counterpoint to that has an impact on the affordability pressure. So it really is judgment to weigh up those two considerations, and how the calibration is set is judgment across those two. Okay, so let me just briefly sum up, and then I'll hand it back to Anna Marie to take any questions or field any questions. As I mentioned probably a multitude of times so far in the talk, that there is a huge amount of evidence internationally on this. It's very clear that those side effects happen, that they can be quite extensive, but the affordability benefit really accrues to the existing incumbent tenants, and they do have an affordability uplift, and that's clear. Tenants looking to enter the rental sector, or potential tenants, they often lose out because there's less properties available. The properties don't turn over as much, and you can have a kind of a incumbent versus potential new entrant situation, with very different inflation rates, and that's something to be mindful. In terms of the developments in Ireland, there are some indicative evidence from our research here that the RPZs have had a material impact on the inflation rate, in particular the distribution of inflation. You can see the change to the distribution coming about from the data, particularly the property level data. And our finding here does hold when we try and control for the economic fundamentals. So it's not just some sort of divergence in the economic activity across the two different, the RPZs and the non-RPZs. I think that makes sense. Again, as we've highlighted in the previous report and this report, there does appear to be evidence of pricing above the cap. So certainly the monitoring, collection of data and exemptions is really important in understanding the compliance around this. Again, I think it's important to note from our economic rationale assessment is that with the continued excess demand for housing that we see in the system, and the potential even in the new with the new high inflationary environment and the economic challenges that both the Irish and the global economies are facing, there does appear to be some sustained upward pressure in the housing market, and it's likely that we're going to need a stabilisation approach, whether it's this or an alternative approach in the market in the period ahead. And we certainly would see these type of mechanisms being a key essential tool in the rental policy architecture going forward. That said, we do need to be cognizant of these side effects and make sure we have them calibrated correctly. So with that, I'll thank everybody for their attention, and I'll hand it back to Anna-Marie.
Conor, thank you so much. That was so impressive. That was so comprehensive and technical, and I definitely learned quite a lot. I have a lot of notes taken that I'll be referring back to later. We have loads of questions come in. We'll try and get through them all, but we'll see how we're doing for time. So I'll just go to the ones in the Q&A first and then move on to the ones in the chat. So the first one, Conor, that came in Denmark, they have an incredibly complex system of rental controls, including a government agency which settle tenancy disputes. For example, one of their rental laws is that any building built before 1991 cannot be rented out for profit, only for costings of maintaining the unit. Would it be helpful to follow a similar model here?
Yeah, so let me think about that. There's quite a bit to unpick in that one. And it can always be difficult to try and lift a set of institutional designs from one context to another and think about how they operate. I guess a couple of the problems that have been seen in some of the European markets, not necessarily specifically Denmark, is that when you have these very clear cost linkages, for example, you can have some of these side effects that occur. So, for example, landlords just really don't maintain the dwellings. They don't have upkeep of those dwellings, even where they may be allowed to increase the rents by cost. So there may be benefits in terms of the affordability boost from a framework like that, but there can also be complexities around how you mitigate some of those side effects. Now, I don't really know the Danish case myself in too much detail, so I wouldn't like to comment on how and whether those have occurred there. But I think that would be, from my point of view, weighing up how you think about that price cap. So the key issue there is do you allow the inflation rate to vary by a market level or by some cap or by cost? That's basically what the point there is. And what we've said is that actually the inflation rate is set to CPI. So if you think about some of the costs in the construction sector for the upkeep of properties at present, it's likely that the cap that we have in place is below the construction cost for many of these items at present. So it will be lower than what the suggestion there is. But I think it is actually how you set up that cap is the key bit. I think one of the things to maybe say a little bit, which I think may be different for Ireland in another context, is who is trying to use the private rental market. So we have a situation in Ireland where we have a very large number of households who are in the private rental sector and in receipt of social housing supports, for example, through the HAP payment, etc. And I think the hope over time would be that many of these tenants may be able to transition to alternative rentals, such as cost rental, which would have that specific cost linkage, or will transition into social housing. So in that context, if we can build out things like the cost rental sector or the alternative rental sectors, then we may be able to think a little bit differently about the private rental sector and who is supposed to be, who the private rental sector is going to serve going forward. And that may help us to think about that particular cap decision.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'll move quickly on to the next one. There's so many questions to get through. Is there any data on the extent to which the decline in rental property availability is linked to accidental landlords? For example, those in negative equity after the crash, exiting the market due to price increases, which might allow them to cover the negative equity when they sell their properties?
That's a really great question. And that's actually, I haven't specifically looked at that. And I know there's been a lot of anecdotal evidence around that, but I haven't seen any conclusive pieces of research on that. But that is something I would really like to do some work on. So has either the increase in the house prices or, say, for example, the RPZ framework pushed landlords to leave the market and to withdraw? So that obviously would be one of the risks internationally that's highlighted with these type of rent control frameworks. So, for example, There's a case in San Francisco that they found some of this historically. So it would be a risk to watch out for with having a framework like this. And actually, I think I don't have any evidence of it now, but actually that's one of the key mechanisms that I really would like to see some research on, actually.
Yes, I was thinking the same thing. Thank you, Anne-Marie, for that. The next one, personal issue in particular, the exemptions and rapid changes in RPZs. While they do make a difference, it's difficult to enforce. And as a tenant, it's very confusing, which makes it even more difficult to know and understand personal rights as a tenant. What can be done about this?
Yeah, I think I probably need to be careful about making any comment on individual circumstances. I'm also not an expert on compliance, regulatory compliance, either in markets like the rental sector. So I wouldn't be probably best placed to comment on the specific, compliance framework. But certainly what we saw in our research was that there were a considerable number of growth rates above the cap, the 4% cap in the period that we looked at, that wouldn't have been necessarily explained by the number of registered exemptions or the number of investments that have happened in the sector. So it would appear that greater insight into what's happening on a compliance basis would make a lot of sense. And I certainly think simplification where possible in the process in what's understanding, what is the understanding, I think would also help. The one thing I would say is that there's a pretty useful tool on the RTB's website where you can put in your information about the property, tells you how much you can increase the rent if you're in these areas, and I think that would be always the best place to go to check these things. And it should be pretty clear for people to put that data in and find out what actually the allowable increase is, and make sure that from a landlord side that's as far as you go, and make sure from a tenant that's as far as it's going. I think that would be the best place to start. There's a calculator there.
Yes, that is actually a brilliant resource. Thank you for highlighting it. And that links to a question that came in from Colm. Do you find significant non-compliance with the caps? So I suppose or do you know the circumstances then surrounding that?
Yeah, so that's one we had to be a little bit careful for, because we don't know the reason specifically for why they were pricing above the 4% cap. So with the data set that we have, we can observe the property twice post the cap period. We can calculate a growth rate, but we don't actually know what exactly explains that. The number of them we see would suggest that there's quite a few of them relative to what certainly my own expectations would have been for the number of exemptions that may be happening, for the investment in the sector. But our role with this research wasn't to look at compliance. It wasn't to assess compliance in a sense. It was really just to look at the pricing effects. And can we say anything about the pricing effects? And I think it's very clear there that certainly there was more of them than I would have expected, but we can't say anything about whether that's compliance or not. That would be appropriate with the data we have or the research we've done.
Mm-hmm. Another question. One issue has been exits of landlords from Ireland. Is there any evidence that this can be mitigated by, for example, restricting the ability of owners or landlords to evict tenants on the sale of a property?
I don't have any evidence for. So that's the mechanism whereby sale is not allowed if you have a sitting tenant. Is that's the case that they're giving there?
I think so, yeah.
I haven't seen any evidence for that particular case in Ireland. It's not the case in Ireland, I know, but I haven't seen any research on that particular mechanism.
Does your analysis include existing tenancies, or is it new tenancies only?
So this is the big drawback with our data. So we only have the new tenancies that are registered with the RTB. Now we do have the Part 4 renewals. So if those properties had an existing tenant that went into a Part 4 renewal over the period of the sample we're looking at, they are included, but the ones that are missed in the middle we don't have. Okay, and actually this is one of the fantastic things that's going to come about when the RTB have the annual registrations information, because they'll be able to look at the full market of existing and new registrations. give us a hugely different picture on the sector. But for our sample, it's Part 4 renewals plus the newly registered tenancies.
Perfect, thank you. In terms of existing landlords, what is your view on this? And are RPZs to blame, or is it externalities at play? It would appear to me that it's more traditional, smaller landlords leaving the market. And we are seeing an influx of institutional type landlords who seem happy with the rental market in Ireland.
There's quite a bit in that. I think, as I mentioned earlier, like the work that we've done, and certainly the research that I've seen, there may be studies I haven't seen either occurring at the moment or the ones that I haven't seen. I haven't seen much information on these supply effects. Mm-hmm. So it's much more difficult to measure because you say, for example, in the tenancies data, we don't have information on investment costs or the expenditures. We don't have as good information on those elements as we would with the price effects. So it's very hard to be conclusive. Like, as I said, you hear anecdotal evidence of this channel happening, but I don't have any evidence to date about how much a contributing factor it is to maybe changes in the sector at present. As I said, it's something I would hope to do if I can get the data to do some work on, because I think it's the kind of missing link to understand really about those externalities in Ireland, how have they worked, whether they've been affected by the RPZs, or is it just the uplift in house prices explaining it. So I think that it is a critical question that we don't really have good evidence on so far. So let's hope whether it's me or other researchers can try and unpick some of those elements in the future.
Perfect. And we just have 2 questions left from Colin. I'm conscious it's just gone past 11, so we'll try to go through quickly. CPI private rent component in the last 12 months has grown 11%. How does this align with your findings? And then secondly, any evidence from the minor data of lower price stock leaving the market and being replaced by higher price stock?
Well, as I said, with the stock and the supply, again, just to reiterate the point, we haven't really done any work on the supply side, and that is one of the, like, we've looked at some of the exemptions in the data, we've looked at some of the trends. You'll see in the report from some of the listings websites like Daft, but to actually do an econometric evaluation of these supply side dynamics, that hasn't happened yet, and I think that's a critical element going forward. So I can't really, like, I guess the point there is that when you have the exits of, when you have a turnover in the market, you've got lower price properties. If they're leaving the market and they're being replaced by the brand new properties which have higher rents, maybe they're in different locations or something like that, then you'll have maybe a change in the average or the distribution of pricing that happens with that. You know, that can occur, and I haven't seen much evidence of that. I haven't tested that hypothesis myself to date. Sorry, the second component was the CPI. Yeah, I think that's one of the complexities. I guess when we were really doing the meat of this research, you know, in last year, it was, this report came out this year, but obviously these things happen quite a bit back from the publication date, and the environment we were seeing there had seen a pickup in inflation, but it was more to do with the supply chain bottlenecks and the rebound in demand that was coming about from the pandemic exit, basically towards last summer, towards the end of last year. And in a sense, the argument we were putting forward there was that, well, look, if there's going to be, Ireland has very low, very stable inflation for many, many years, and therefore the 4% cap was okay, because when you've got, say, 1 or 2% inflation, and that happens for a long period of time, and you have 4%, then that provides a real return. That's not the case when you have inflation rates escalating above the cap. Then you actually have a position where you have a nominal fall in rents. So the argument we were making in the paper is that it does make sense to index. There's many other cases about how you index. So therefore the link to the HICP makes sense in that index case. But then the corollary is if you move to a really high inflation environment like we have at the present, mainly coming about from the external factors that are completely outside our control, that can pose two challenges. One, to the affordability at the cap for the incumbent tenants, but also how do you ensure you try and allow the investment and the maintenance of the sector.
Right. Thank you so much, Conor, for all of this. Extremely grateful. And thanks to everyone who joined us today. We had a huge number of people coming and going, which is great. I'll leave you go. It is 11:05, so we're a little bit overdue, but we need it every second, if not more. We'll have another Simon Talk coming up in a couple of weeks. So we hope to see you there. It's going to be about hidden homelessness. I'm really looking forward to it personally. And thank you all so much. Have a great day.